Canada's Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault in Vancouver. Carbon tax backlash after announcing a big carbon tax exemption that primarily benefits Atlantic Canada. The Trudeau government under pressure to bring in tax relief that'll benefit the rest of the country, all Canadians, regardless of what type of energy they use to heat their homes. On Monday, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre will force a vote in the House of Commons, calling for the tax to be taken off all home heating costs. It's definitely turned into a political headache for the Liberals. And by the way, they have said there will be no more carve-outs. So the question, have they lost control of the narrative here? Let's bring back the front bench. Sabrina Grover, Melanie Paradis, Guradan Singh, Rachel Aiello. And Mel, I'm going to start with you on this one. Are they reading the room, so to speak, or not, about where Canadians are at right now on the carbon tax? You know, the perception of paying more taxes during tough economic times.
Well, I think that they've come to the realization that they finally have to admit that the carbon tax is unaffordable and it's not going to work. So ultimately, I think that they're going to end up having to scrap the whole thing. I hope that they vote in support of Pierre Poilievre's bill, certainly to remove it from home heating, all forms of home heating. Doug Ford today, Premier Ford in Ontario, wrote a letter to the Ontario Liberal caucus members, so all of the MPs who are Liberal in the province of Ontario, urging them to call on their caucus to get rid of the carbon tax on home heating, because Ontario has a much higher percentage of people who heat their homes with natural gas rather than with oil. I think it's only 2.5% heat with oil in Ontario. And MPs in the Atlantic provinces made it clear that they managed to get that exemption for oil heating because they basically lobbied their caucus internally. So Doug Ford said, "Hey, Ontario Liberals, why don't you do the same for us here?" So hopefully we start to see some change in the days ahead. They've certainly lost the narrative.
I think, Sabrina, people understand, of course, that climate change is real and there's a threat there, but many feel squeezed financially, maybe even a bit scolded by politicians. There are signs that public opinion may be turning against climate change policy, some of them anyway, in big Western democracies, places like Canada, Germany, the UK. If that's true, where does that leave Justin Trudeau?
Listen, I think the biggest narrative loss for the Liberals on this issue has been not being able to explain why energy prices are high and ceding to the opposition the narrative on the carbon tax. Energy prices are high because of a myriad of facts, most of which are global. Geopolitical relations, the Russia-Ukraine war, the fact that OPEC has cut production time and time again over the last year. And, you know, this isn't just a narrative. These are facts. This is what the U.S. is basing their energy prices on. We've seen electricity prices rise here in Canada and in the U.S., and there's no carbon tax on electricity, and you're still seeing those prices rise. And so the ability for the Conservatives to pigeonhole the Liberals and blame this affordability crisis on the carbon tax has really been a win for them and has unfortunately placed the Liberals on their back foot. And even using this word like carve out, like that's one of the biggest losses on this whole thing. Like we have lots of regional programs that affect only certain parts of the country. I think what the Liberals need to do is refocus some of their narrative on affordability, on demonstrating all of the things that they've done to increase affordability across the country, including the grocery tax rebate and including some of their other measures. And then on their carbon policy or on their environmental policy, they need to prove what is being done and what are the positive outcomes of their large emitters policy. That's where the carbon tax is really making a difference. It's on large emitters and it's on the industrial policy. So what have the wins been and why should Canadians still believe in this policy?
To you, Guradan, and the Prime Minister and others ruling out any sort of further exemption for other forms of home heating. Do you think he'll be able to stick to that pledge?
Well, the reality is that this policy from the outside of it is a bad policy. To have this carve out of a very specific region, which is clearly politically motivated to protect those seats and those ridings, you should never base a policy to help a policy that should be motivated on helping folks should not be motivated or predicated upon political outcomes for MPs in that area. So it's problematic. The Liberals have really fumbled this whole entire file. And on this particularly, it's such a bad set of politics, a setup in which people are feeling now that, you know, it's simply to protect seats, there's an exception being made, while Canadians across this nation are all going to be struggling to heat their homes. Winter is coming, and affordability needs to be at the forefront of any policy that comes forward across the board for all Canadians.
Rachel, I know you've already started writing about and what could be a so-called carbon tax federal election whenever it comes.
Yeah, we'll see. Both sides, Todd, really seemed open to that idea. Some of the Liberals suggesting that they've ran a couple elections on their climate action plans, and that worked pretty well for them. So we'll see. There is, if best laid plans are what they are, a long time between now and the next election. But I think what the Liberals failed to do here is frame this in a way that wasn't so regionally specific. You know, the Prime Minister came out, backed by his Atlantic caucus, saying he was listening to their concerns and this was going to be a measure to help them. Instead of perhaps going around and doing it the other way, and some of the messaging we've heard this week talking about, just like we wanted to phase out coal, we have realized that home heating oil is extremely expensive, more polluting, and disproportionately impacting lower income families. And as a result of targeting this specific ill or issue in the system, we are going to offer this rebate and do it in a more broad-based way instead of what they, I think, tried to have their cake and eat it too here a bit, Todd. Nod to the Atlantic Canadian MPs that pushed for this, conveniently noting the fact that this was more proportionately going to help that region. And I think there could have been opportunity there to note and put out those stats right away when this was announced about the other communities, towns, cities in other parts of the country that do still rely on home heating oil outside of Atlantic Canada.
It's interesting. We were talking to the finance minister of Alberta earlier on the show, and he said, you know, during his meeting today with Chrystia Freeland, that was all about the Alberta pension plan. They wanted to talk about the carbon tax, and it was off the table for this meeting, which was just about the Alberta pension situation as well. Back to you, Mel. And you know, we're also hearing the NDP will support this Conservative motion next week as well. What's the takeaway?
Well, I think that's great news, and I hope that the NDP do support the Conservative motion. And I hope that it passes. Although, as we know, with opposition motions, doesn't actually beholden the government to take the direction from Parliament. Although I hope that they do. I think that this is another example of the federal government just not being an honest broker with the provinces and being willing to have real conversations with them. Leaving the carbon tax off the table when you're meeting with a minister of a province is just it's bad brinksmanship for sure. So I hope that in the days ahead that that Liberal caucus puts more pressure on PMO to take action here to get rid of the carbon tax and not just put a 3-year pause on it, get rid of it on home heating entirely. I'd love to see it gone completely.
To you, Sabrina, do you ever worry that the Prime Minister or the Deputy Prime Minister, Environment Minister, Natural Resources Minister may come across sometimes as being too lecturing or scolding or condescending about issues surrounding the environment?
I think certainly one of the things that the Prime Minister is going to have to really take a hold on right now is caucus unity. And so, you know, it was, again, great for Atlantic MPs to come out and push for this, but what is that caucus unity message that's going to come across and talk about affordability for the whole country? We do have Liberal MPs elected here in Alberta. Where's their voice? What's their voice going to be? And when you talk about, you know, the relationship between MPs and ministers, I think that negotiation between MPs and Minister Wilkinson, Minister Guilbeault, Minister Freeland is going to be really, really important. And just to your earlier point on whether or not this is going to be an election fought on the carbon tax, I think with every passing year, it's impossible to ignore the devastating impacts of climate change. Over half our country was on fire, you know, this summer. And it's not like it's going to get better next year. And so I think for those Canadians that are really physically seeing the impacts of climate change and extreme weather events in their own backyards, it is going to be an issue, and how government responds to that is going to be important. And you know, the Conservatives can go around talking about axe the tax. They had to stop one of their rallies this summer just because of a fire. They don't have they don't have an environmental plan. They don't have a climate plan. The costs of that are going to escalate, and I don't think that they're going to bring to the table anything relevant or what Canadians want to see.
I know, Garad, and this is something the NDP have thought about too, this idea that, you know, people can agree that climate change is real and it is a clear and present danger, but oftentimes the pocketbook issues can trump that when people have a hard time making ends meet. So that's the challenge for any government that's in power.
It is, but we also look at climate change as an economic issue as well. So this is, you know, if we look at the impact that climate change, these forest fires will have on our healthcare system by way of its impact on young people, on jobs, the economic disruption that occurred with these forest fires across the entire nation. We can't divorce and look at climate change as one thing and our economy as another thing. If anything, good climate policy should be bolstering and bringing in a new green economy, a just transition, along with addressing the myriad of issues that occur when you have an out of control climate crisis like we are currently facing right now in Canada. The issue, I think, is that the Liberals have just done such a bad job on managing this and communicating this that it's not, and along with the variety of other affordability issues that they failed on, that this is not hitting the ears that it needs to in the correct way. And that's a really big loss, not just for Canada, but for this world, because we're all connected with respect to the impacts that the environment will have. So the environment is an economic issue and needs to be understood as such. But sadly, with the Liberals currently in their mismanagement, that's not being understood by Canadians.
Last word to you on this, Rachel. Just what Garatin is saying, build on that. You know, the idea that this is also a problem with messaging and trying to communicate the seriousness of this, and there's a failure on the part of the government.
Todd, I don't know how many panels I've been on where we've been talking about the issues with Liberal messaging. Yes, this is one of them. But I'm really curious to watch next week where this goes beyond Monday's vote, a non-binding motion from the opposition. We've now heard kind of the airing of grievances from provinces. So what happens next? The federal government has clearly said no more carve-outs are coming. Will the pressure continue to the point that they have to retreat on that? Or are we kind of getting this out in the open now? And are we going to be moving on next week? We'll see.
Rachel Aiello, Sabrina Grover, Melanie Paradis, Garatin Singh, our front bench on this Friday. Great to see all of them, and thanks for this. Have a great weekend ahead.